So we begin this news hour with breaking news as a second day of a Gaza ceasefire talks has just ended in Doha. Mediators from Qatar, Egypt, and the United States have released a joint statement. They say the discussions were serious, constructive, and conducted in a positive atmosphere. Technical teams will work over the coming days on the details of implementation, including arrangements for the comprehensive humanitarian components of the agreement and those related to hostages and detainees. Senior officials will meet again in Cairo before the end of next week in the hopes of reaching an agreement on those new terms. Well, our correspondents are following these developments across the Middle East and the United States. In a moment, we'll be hearing from Hamda Salhout, who's standing by in Amman, Jordan, for Israeli reaction. First, though, let's bring in Mohammed Jamjoom, who's been following the talks here in Doha. Mohammed, can you walk us through where we stand at this hour?
So, Cyril, we have seen a statement that was released by the U.S., Qatar, and Egypt at the conclusion of these 2 days of ceasefire talks here in Doha. Now, I want to read just two portions of this statement to try to walk you and our viewers through where we are right now. One portion says that this proposal builds on the points of agreement achieved over the past week and closes the remaining gaps in a manner that allows for the rapid implementation of the agreement. Another portion says that the U.S., with the support of the State of Qatar and the Arab Republic of Egypt, presented to both parties a proposal that narrows the gaps between the parties and is consistent with the principles set out by President Biden on May 31st, 2024. Now, the reason I wanted to read those two portions is because the language there suggests that the mediators are far more optimistic today than they had been leading into these talks. You're talking about bridging the gaps. You're talking about narrowing the gaps, closing the gaps. That's what these talks were supposed to do when it comes to trying to implement either the framework agreement that had been presented by U.S. President Joe Biden at the end of May and had agreed to by Hamas in early July, or any type of amended agreement that came thereafter. Now, there's still a lot of questions, not that many answers at this hour. As you said in your lead-in to me, there are going to be technical teams working on this over the course of the next week. You're going to have another meeting that's going to be taking place in Cairo before the end of next week. It does seem right now that there is momentum. And that, at the moment, is a big positive step, considering where we were just 24 hours ago, when we weren't sure what exactly was going on behind closed doors. Now, there's still so many issues we don't know where they've landed on right now. We don't know what's going on when it comes to proposals about who's going to be in the Philadelphia corridor. We don't know what happens when it comes to the number of Palestinian prisoners that might be released. But the language of this statement thus far suggests that the mediators feel that there is momentum right now, and there is much more optimism about the possibility of closing those gaps in the days ahead than there was just 24 hours ago. Cyril?
Mohammed Jamjoom reporting from Doha. Thank you very much for that. Let's go to Hamda Salhout in the Jordanian capital, and a reminder that our team is there because the Israeli government has banned Al Jazeera from reporting inside Israel. So, Hamda, now that the mediators have spoken, everyone's going to be scrutinizing any reactions from either Hamas or Israel. Is there anything on the Israeli side?
Well, some leaks and reports within Israeli media are indicating that there's been some progress made on key issues, but that there are still sticking points that remain. You have to remember that Netanyahu has had a hardened stance throughout the entire time. Negotiations have been happening throughout the entirety of this year. And in fact, since the last ceasefire deal collapsed nearly 9 months ago, there's been so much pressure on Netanyahu from not just internationally, but domestically, from families of Israeli captives who've been protesting his leadership nonstop. And you also have to remember that within his own government, there are members within his coalition who do not want to see a deal at all. And in fact, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is set to arrive in Israel on Sunday, and he'll meet with Netanyahu on Monday. And some reports are indicating that he's expected to be quite tough on Netanyahu in order to try and really get to the bottom of what the sticking points need to be solved so that everyone can enter into a ceasefire agreement on the same term. This is going to be Blinken's 10th visit to Israel since the war began. And throughout these visits, he has been tough on Netanyahu. He has voiced his opposition and U.S. pressure to a lot of Israeli policy. But even though there was all of that pressure from the United States, Netanyahu was still seemingly unfazed.
Hamda Salhout reporting from the Jordanian capital, Amman. Thank you very much for that, Hamda. And Alan Fisher joins us now from Washington, D.C. Alan, the U.S. is right in the middle of all of this. First of all, the plan was presented by Biden back in May, and this statement that we just got says that the bridging proposals, right, the details they're talking about, that's been presented even by the U.S. Are you learning anything new, either out of the State Department or the White House? Anything at all on your end at this point?
Well, of course, the thing to point out here is there's no deal until there's a deal. So they can talk this up, as they have done in Washington over the last 10 weeks, about how both sides are close, how there's small gaps, how they think they can bridge it. These talks have been, we are told, comprehensive, and they've been intense, and they think there is the groundwork for a deal. But there's still some mechanisms to be put in place, and that means there is no deal till there's a deal. Now, the idea that Antony Blinken is going to the Middle East, that was talked about last weekend. Christopher Sheridan, who is our White House producer, he's been speaking to people in the last hour, and he has heard from the State Department that while Blinken is likely to head to the Middle East, it's still not a done deal. And that would suggest that he isn't going to go unless it's almost certain that there are going to be signatures on paper and that there's going to be a ceasefire deal put in place. He won't fly to the region unless he thinks it's going to happen. He may need to go to put last-minute pressure on both sides, particularly the Israelis, because, of course, you'll remember that when this was revealed way back at the end of May, in June, the Americans were saying, well, Hamas should accept this. This is a good deal. And Hamas did. And then the problem they had was that the Israelis didn't. And they've been putting pressure on them for the last 10 weeks. Clearly, politically, Joe Biden would like this as a legacy issue, that he managed to bring some semblance of peace to the Middle East. But let me say one more time, there's no deal until there's a deal.
That's Al Jazeera's Alan Fisher reporting from Washington, D.C. Thank you very much for that, Alan.